like a cinnamon apple cider tea. So
Okay. That's not bad. As replacements for coffee go, could be worse.
yeah, it's fun. Feels fall.
Mm-hmm.
Also, this is my new pipe.
Oh, whoa.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. Where'd you get that from? Oh, is that the one you said you got, the reading one?
Yeah. So I got this one at there was a thrift store or like an antique store, and there was this whole collection this guy was selling off of like 20 pipes. Some were broken, some were mangled. There were like 3 good condition ones, and so I was just kind of looking them up online because I figured I'd get one. Um, and then I saw this one online. This is the Peterson. Peterson is an Irish pipe making company, very famous. I think one of the most famous brands. Um, yeah, Peterson of Dublin, and this pipe model is called the Killarney, I think.
Okay. Killarney's a place in Ireland, I think. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure it is.
Yes. Well, I know that's also the name of this model. I don't know much about it being a place, but that would make sense. But yeah, I've smoked it a few times. I really love it. It's so different from my other pipes that there's a bit of a curve. All my other pipes are straight.
Yeah.
And that was just the style that my great grandfather liked, which is why those are the ones I have. And now I'm used to them, so I kind of like them. I think some of the ones I have are a lot lighter than this too, and so they kind of, I don't know, they stick out, but they kind of are a little more like floaty in the mouth. This one sits nicely in the mouth, but it is a little heavier. But I can also put more tobacco in it. So
Right. That looks more similar to mine.
yes,
In terms of like overall build, I guess the brim of yours tapers outward where mine is in, but otherwise it's pretty similar.
yeah, it definitely. It's cool though. I'm enjoying it so far. Like I said, bit of a learning curve, but that's
Yeah.
fun too. So everything with pipes is a learning curve.
Learning curve. Yes. Okay, so what are we talking about today?
Yeah. So well, first of all, happy Halloween and good morning.
That's right. It's Halloween today. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any plans for later?
I think we're gonna go to the gym,
Good.
or there's a small group of people who are in the area who are like in their 20s who like surfing and skating and that sort of thing, and they're meeting tonight, so we might actually go to that. But yeah, that'll be fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
Having a little get together with my friends here, just hanging out, having dinner, eating some candy, chatting, playing games, all that.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today I wanted to jump into maybe the beginning of what could be a multi-part series, but kind of diving into like a little bit of politics, foundations of society, and then at the root of it all, kind of the state of man. Maybe a few different views on what people have sort of concluded the state of man is, or the starting point of man. And foundationally, I think in this episode, we can kind of introduce people into this whole idea and what it means, what the state of man means, and how a lot of philosophers have used that idea to kind of move forward with the rest of what they do. Whether they specialize in politics or they specialize in society or behavior or culture, most philosophers seem to start with the state of man and kind of go from there. So while we're packing our pipes and kind of getting into smoking, if you want to kind of dive into what that even means, what the state of man means, then maybe we can talk a little bit, about that, and then we can dive into just maybe a few famous views of the state of man, and then what they mean and why we would think about them moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, so state of man, you might have also heard it called state of nature. is basically a theoretical starting point where man existed without society. So, in other words, nobody has any obligation to any other. It's just you and the world, and there are other people in it, but you don't have any relation to them or obligation to them. And just kind of, and I say theoretical time. Nobody that I know makes the case that things were ever actually like this, or if they were, not for very long. Because society becomes necessary, perhaps, or at least beneficial very quickly, as we'll see as we kind of poke around these various ideas of how it would go. But the idea is that the state of nature or state of man, the nature of it, like what it would be like without society, informs how we should run society, and also how society even comes to exist, which also tells us a lot about its purpose, and what kinds of things we should be trying to accomplish with it. Basically, political philosophy views society like a tool for either the provision of certain benefits or for the avoidance of certain problems. And so what the state of nature does is give us insight into what those problems or benefits might be, and then we can sort of start talking about how best to bring those things about.
Yeah. And another thing to just kind of touch on too, is definitely why it's constructive to sort of remove all these barriers. For a lot of people who don't know maybe about why you would do this, like you're saying, it's very foundational. It kind of helps you take a look at the groundwork of what the beginnings of society might have looked like, but also by removing all of these different distractions of like other people groups, tribes, countries, land masses, animals, resources. When you remove all that away and you just settle on humankind or man alone in maybe an imaginary grass field, you're sort of at a blank slate in terms of law and rule and what is necessary. And so you get to start from the beginning, and move from there. And so people will use this not only to try to design what they think a society should look like, but also to try to look back and see maybe what happened to some groups or even humankind at large, after kind of filling in some of these different details and some of these different distractions, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that comes up first when you're looking at the different perspectives of state of man is sort of the order of your obligations. And so most people in moral theory assume an obligation to yourself, which is interesting, I guess. I don't know exactly what the origin of that is. I'm trying to remember. It's been a little bit since I've been in the class where we spoke about this. I think most people just assume it, an obligation that you have to, protect or take care of yourself, and kind of look out for your own interests to start with. And that ends up kind of becoming the foundation of any obligations you might have to other things.
Yeah. And I think another reason people will kind of start with that is because it's kind of, you can use it as like an introspective look at the individual man and some of the maybe inherent issues that come with a man just being alone, or even if you take a sort of Cartesian look at it, you get to kind of deconstruct what's important to the individual, or what is even there in regards to the individual.
And when you say Cartesian, like, what do you mean by that?
Good point. Um, so little crash course. Descartes was a very prominent philosopher. So Cartesian just comes from Descartes and his way of doubting. He famously wrote, I think, therefore I am, which is so much more to unpack than what we're going to do. But a lot of what Descartes did was he took things down to the bare bones. He took society, he took man, he took God and man's relationship with the divine down to just the very, if there's nothing else, there is the individual, at the very least. Even if the individual is being, um, you know, placed under some sort of hypnotic spell, or there's an illusion, or you're in the matrix, like maybe you're being deceived, but there is at least still the individual that's perceiving. And so that's why he sort of tore it down to that, which is a great place to start, because you have the very bottom. You have a place to go up from. And so we won't look at what he did too much after that, because I mean, we could spend probably a couple hours literally just talking about Descartes and what he wrote. But in a very Cartesian sense, we can look at the state of man as being the perceiver, the one who's intaking information and interacting with at least what he believes is in front of and around him, which is all that man has. So it's best to at least behave that that's the case, that you have what's in front of you. And then we move from there, and we can kind of, from there, start laying in framework. So how should man engage with nature? How should man engage with himself, with the truth or the divine? How should man engage with any animal? How should man engage with any other being, even another man that he engages with? What does he do? What should he do? What might he do? And then from there, we can pick up from not just one individual, but a group. And then from there, how that group behaves. And that's sort of the pattern that's laid out for a lot of philosophers who will take that and go from there.
So
Yeah,
to circle this idea back to the obligation that the individual has to himself, I think one of the, you said something interesting. I think you said that's kind of all you have is what you're perceiving and what you're experiencing. And I think some people might say, okay, so like, why do you have an obligation to yourself? Because you could choose at any point to stop existing, and what's the point of doing that? What's the point of not doing that? Like, why would you be obligated to not take that path? And I think the answer, to not delve too deep into skepticism, but if we're doubting everything, we also have to doubt that we actually do have the ability to stop existing, right? So from many worldviews, ours in particular, but many others, you actually don't really have the power to stop existing. You have the power to stop being alive on Earth. But there's very little evidence that you have the power to stop being at all. Which...
Yeah. Okay. I like where this is going, and I think this may be the direction we should head in, but I want to clarify a few things first. So what we're looking at right now is the sort of relationship of man with himself and how many parts or facets there are to the individual. And I think that's important to note, because some people might be like, oh, well, if a man dies, he stops existing. That's not really what you're talking about here. You're talking about much more than that, not just the physical, but then maybe other elements of that individual as well, correct?
Right. And I think it doesn't even matter, for the sake of this exercise that we're doing, whether there actually is or not. It's certainly the case that there might be. And so it's not at all clear that you do have the power to stop existing. It could be the case that you have the power to stop existing, but I think the mere fact that it might not be gives you a certain level of obligation, because one of Descartes' whole things is that he's doubting everything. And so if we're going to be doubtful of that and just look at the individual itself, it seems like you have it seems like being is all that you're sure that you have. And so because of that, you have an obligation to understand and engage with and, I guess, provide for the flourishing of that, because anything else, any other decision that you make is based on little evidence. And I think, I'm not a proper skeptic. I don't think you need 100% certainty epistemologically. And by that I mean, epistemology is just a branch of philosophy concerned with the nature of knowledge and the nature of truth. But I don't have a skeptic epistemology. I don't think you need 100% certainty for everything. But if we're breaking
Mm.
everything down to brass tacks, and if you're just a man in the middle of nowhere thinking about what to do, I don't think it's a safe option for you to assume that you have the ability to stop existing, even if you did have, for some reason, motivation to want to do that, which I don't think very many people actually do. But even if you did, I don't think that that's a safe path to take based on the information that you have available to you just by yourself in this hypothetical grass field we're talking about. So that puts us at a place, if you agree, where you're in the grass field and you have an obligation to provide for your own flourishing, I guess is how I'd put that.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting too, if we're when you're in the grass field, it almost doesn't seem like the idea is that there's nothing that's happened yet, right? So it's just humankind, man, standing in the grass field, the individual. Nothing has happened, good or bad, or for or against the man in the grass field to cause him this sort of desire to want to no longer exist. At the very least, you would say there's reason enough to keep on existing because you do, and because there's nothing working against you to stop that.
Mm-hmm. Well, even
Yeah.
so, I don't think it will be very long before the man comes across some things that might provide him some different motivations as we start slowly building out our grass field.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because presumably, once you so you're if you're this man, right? Presumably, once you find out that you exist, um, it probably wouldn't take you long from there to start exploring the limits of your capabilities. Whatever,
Yeah.
and in whatever context that is, even if you're a brain in a vat, what are your capabilities within the vat? What can you do? What can you sense? What can you interact with?
Yeah.
So I think we move out of the grass field pretty quickly once we have existence kind of thoroughly decided on,
Yeah.
or beyond
That's
the
true.
limits of the grass field, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So then you might come across some things that, I don't know. We don't have to necessarily define exactly what those are, but that make you kind of question what your obligations are. And so I think pretty quickly you can come to the conclusion you at least have an obligation to yourself. And so maybe now is the point at which we start introducing some other things to
Yeah.
our hypothetical here.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, and there's some philosophers who won't go this far back because they don't believe that that state is necessary to go to, or that it ever existed. And so they'll say, well, at the very least, you start with a few other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely a few famous perspectives in philosophy. Um, but yeah, so from there, you kind of have a basic understanding of, yeah, some sort of, you have yourself and then what's in front of you. So if it's just man in the state of nature, maybe he interacts with what's around him, whether that be trees or mud or animals, things like that. The relationship that man has with those things, some people would say, I think it's commonly agreed that there's a sort of, because man is very capable and intelligent, that he has a sort of duty to those things as well, not to misuse them or abuse them, um, but to sort of tame them and interact with them in a healthy manner. That that healthy manner would probably include not excessive harm to either himself or nature,
Mm-hmm.
um, but working towards maintaining both of those things. Um,
So it's going to become
and
very quickly apparent to the man that he needs to take from nature to continue to exist, which we've already determined is something he has to do, or to continue to live, whether that means continuing to exist or not. And so I think you very quickly run into a part of the state of nature that John Locke is very concerned about. Locke is a very economically minded philosopher, and especially as you start to introduce other people into the equation, but even if you only have yourself, resource management becomes an obligation very early on. You'll sort of start to realize that nature can provide things relatively infinitely, but only at a limited rate, not at an infinite rate, right? So you're going to need, maybe you are gathering fruits to eat or killing animals to eat. And eventually, if you overdo it, or if you take too much, if you overdo it, you're going to run out of them. If you take too much, it's going to spoil. Like there's a built-in balance that has to be maintained, regardless of whether you want to or not. And again, I bring that up because we're talking about obligations that you have kind of no matter what. And if we are assuming that you exist and you're obliged to continue to do that in the current mode that you understand, then you are also obliged to manage your resources appropriately, not taking too much, taking enough to survive. And that becomes a little more complex once we introduce other people, but I don't know if we're ready to do that yet.
Yeah, I think we should jump into ownership and what that looks like too.
Yeah.
So far we've started with just that the man has himself. And so some people would argue that that's ownership, the ownership of the self. Some people would say that if there is the divine and man knows that there is the divine, like some higher being above man, maybe he belongs to that with some sort of joint ownership or at least governance over himself.
Mm-hmm.
So at the very least, it seems appropriate to say that man is over himself, and then the extensions of himself. So extensions of himself would be like the things belonging to him, his limbs, his faculties, his mobility, and then other things that may not actually be a part of him and his body and mind and soul. So,
right,
like if you a stick that belonging to him, what does that sort of ownership look like? Because that's a new level of ownership.
Mm-hmm. And I want to point out before we move into owning anything else, I think the reason that we assume self-ownership is simply because, as yet, in our situation, there's nobody else contending for that position. It's just you. Like, there's no animals that will try to take control of your body, or certainly not your mind. And there's pretty much nothing that is going to try to take control of your mind as we build this out. That's pretty much always owned by the self, simply because, and we know that simply because nothing else has the capability of taking control of that. But even your body, at this point, there's nothing to kick you out of that seat of power over yourself. And so we kind of assume that you own those things because nothing else can govern them as yet.
Yeah.
Which might change later on down the line, particularly for the body, but we'll get there.
Yeah. So then what we jump to is, can man own things that are not his body, his mind, his soul? So maybe other things, like if you were to interact with a blade of grass or a stick or a rock, different natural resources. So can man own those things is a big question. And what would you say? Can a man own those things?
Well, as yet, it sort of doesn't matter because there's not much contesting him for that. I think the animals might, but we've already kind of established that man has an obligation sort of against the animals to gather resources for his continued existence, and that's really all they're contesting him for. And I think so far we haven't. So far we've been assuming that the man is also capable which I think has generally been the case throughout history, of taking the resources from the animal. So it's not as though there's anybody yet that is contesting him for the resources. So ownership sort of doesn't quite come into it yet until we start introducing other people, which might be time to do now.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. So, as far as we know, and even if we were to take some religious perspectives, that point in which there's only one man, maybe one woman, seems to end relatively shortly. And then we enter to a time now where it's man in the state of nature, and maybe there are one, two, maybe a few other men in his general area that he can interact with.
Right. Well, hold on. Before we go there, I want to. I think the idea, especially if we're looking at this from a Christian view, but even many religions, the man and the woman. It's like the first person that gets introduced often is the woman, in addition to the man, and they're sort of naturally compatible, and so there's the assumption that they come together and start a family, which is going to go on to be a very important unit of politics. Um, and so I don't know. I guess what does that look like? I don't remember us talking about that much in our classes, but
Yeah.
if we're
Well, I
kind of
actually wrote a paper about this in political philosophy.
yes, you had political philosophy. I didn't, so I'll defer to you on this point.
Yeah.
I
Well,
wish I
I
did.
did. I did write that before I introduced, I went to the state of nature and man. Um, and before I introduced other men, I did introduce a woman. And so the way this would play out is that men and women have differences that are significant and obvious. Um, and what's kind of understood is that at the very least, if there's only one man and one woman, and they have no reason to not like each other, it's very obviously clear that they could help each other. And especially that they're so well suited to so many different things that if they were to be together in union and in harmony, they could do so many more things. From having a better living situation, a better sort of household or garden, or just better maintenance of nature and resources, as well as continuing mankind on through family.
Not to mention
So
expanding your potential for gathering resources and thriving and such, with having more
correct,
people on your side, so to say,
correct.
which we'll get into later.
So I was a lot younger when I wrote my paper, and I took the direction of I added a woman and then another man, and I said, there we have the first conflict, because the men that, let's say there's one woman and two men, it's likely the case that the men will have the very first thing to have a conflict about, and that's that one of them will want to be with the woman, or both of them will, and only one will.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that that's the direction we need to take here. Let's just say for now that man and woman are joined together, and that they can create something like a family. So then we have this sort of extension of mankind's reach through his children. Um, and if you have children, they can begin to work with you and alongside you as they grow. Eventually, the original man dies, and then we have the first bit of sort of transferal of rights and ownership that the former man has already done. So if the former man has applied his work to given things, like he has built something like some sort of shelter, something to preserve and look after, there's that ownership, that right is passed down to his children naturally. I think that's what makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we can actually even use John Locke's ownership framework for that. So I think
Okay.
this is a good time to return to that for a moment.
Yeah.
Um, we'll introduce other contesting parties later for ownership of resources and such, but so John Locke believes that ownership is kind of the basis of society, and it's also worth mentioning, by the way, that this is about where most philosophers who talk about the state of nature really start. Not that many people are super interested in going back to the bare bones basic state of man stuff, and they just kind of start state of nature. So you have a man and a family, and
Yeah.
them existing at first on their own in the world.
Yeah.
And so even within the family, there's contest for ownership, right? So I mean, anybody who's ever had a sibling knows that. Um, but so John Locke's theory is that you own your body, you own your mind, and your body and mind are, or at least your body is basically a tool that's capable of labor. And labor, he treats labor almost as like a metaphysical resource. I don't know if he would argue that that's actually what it is, but he treats it almost as though it is. And it's something that you can sort of mix with or apply to externals to yourself. So if you have a tree, the example that our philosophy professor used frequently is that if you have a tree that's producing apples, by reaching up to the apple and taking it out of the tree, you have applied your labor to the apple, and the apple becomes sort of mixed, so to say, with your labor. And so because you've applied your labor to the apple, in a sense, you've made the apple a part of yourself, because your labor is already something that you own, because your body's already something that you own. And so it's sort of this chain of, on down from your mind. Your mind causes your body, which you own, to expend the labor, which you own because of your body, and the labor mixes with the apple, which you own because of your labor, which you own because of your body, which you own because of your mind. And it's sort of this unbroken chain that kind of goes on down, extending from the mind. And so I think, well, if I'll pause for a second, and if you want to comment on that at all, and if not, I think I can bring this around back to the family thing.
Yeah, that's helpful to do. We should do that soon. But I was just going to say, I think some people view labor not as much as a resource, but like you're saying, as a sort of extension. Because labor is then what you do with your inherent, like with yourself, like with your hands. Anything that you do, like picking something up, that's a sort of labor. That's what we're referring to. Which is why some people would say it could be a resource. Some would say that it's just an extension,
Of the body. Right.
Yeah. But yeah, continue.
Okay, so to wrap this back around to the family, I don't know that John Locke does this. I can't recall, honestly. But in my head, the way that this works is, so you have a man and a woman, and they come together to produce a child. Using John Locke's framework, that's basically a similar thing to using your body to labor to, pick an apple or create something with wood that you chop down or whatever it is. So you own this thing that you've produced with your labor, and it grows up into it's a person, and it grows up into a man. But I think eventually, so one of the principles of how ownership can transfer is that if somebody who owns something gives something to somebody else, it can transfer. I'm going to take a pause here. We'll edit this out. My grandparents just pulled up, so I'm going to say hi to them and then continue our filming.
Okay.
So give me just one moment. Hey, morning. I'm just recording a video with my friend. But... I think the door's open. If not, you might have to go into the basement. But I hope so. I don't know if Mom and Dad are up yet. I haven't seen. I've always been up like 7. All right, sorry about that. They're staying at a hotel, so my grandfather just pulled up. All right. So where were we? Mixing labor. Oh yes, children and how that works, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Well, not quite about. I don't think we're touching on that.
not quite what?
I don't think we're gonna touch on how children come about. But
Oh yeah, we can probably leave that. I'm sure there's plenty of other videos that would be rather instructional in that department. But for our purposes, child comes about basically owned by the parents in the same way that labor mixing works with other things. But what's interesting is there's a certain point at which once you own something, you sort of transfer the ownership from one person to another. And I think the child is an interesting case with regards to that, because we've already said the man owns himself because there's nobody else who can sort of contest that. And so that's the case for the mind of the child as it develops. But also I think the body, like the grown man can sort of contest the child for the ownership of his body, right? He can kind of overpower the child and kind of make him do what he wants him to do, which is, often what we do today with our children, stopping them from doing unsafe or counterproductive things. But eventually it becomes the case that that's not possible anymore. And I think at that point, one of two things happens. Either the ownership voluntarily passes from the father to his child, or the mother to her child, or the child is capable of taking it for himself by either leaving, or if there's a physical struggle for that ownership, theoretically defeating his father, or this is kind of an archetype that's very deep in human storytelling. Also, you can see sort of the father that wants to maintain control, and kind of exercise his authority over the child, past its productive due, and eventually the child becomes powerful enough that that's not the case. That's not possible for him to do anymore. And so either way, it comes about that as the child matures into a man or a woman, they kind of take ownership of themselves, whether that's a peaceful transfer of power or a non-peaceful transfer of power. But either way, I think you can use John Locke's framework of labor mixing to say that the parents own, in a sense, their child, and then eventually that becomes not the case anymore. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. That's definitely a perspective on sort of child rearing. But I think we also see here the first sort of, maybe not government, but society when we have the family unit, at least in the smallest scale. That's the essence of the word, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is why, if we're to fast forward a couple thousands of years, I think that's practical still to this day, since it's so foundational. That is the micro society. That is society. That's the essence of the family unit, which is why it's so important. And unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of issues today that are sort of, especially in modern politics and government, without diving too much deep into party-specific blame, we'll just say there's a sort of unfortunate strike to try to disharmonize the family unit, which will only cause harm to the rest of society as well.
Yeah. And that's part of why I go into this process of ownership of the parents. And I realize ownership is sort of a crude word for what it actually is. And I don't mean to suggest that there's not more to it than that. I'm just kind of our point of our exercise here is to take it down to the very bare bones of what's going on, and what obligations you have and such. But I think that it's important still to look at those foundations, because I do think today there is an increasing perspective that perhaps part of this breaking down of the family unit that you mentioned might be that there's an increasing perspective that the parents don't necessarily own the child or have authority over the child, if that's a nicer way to put it. Um,
Yeah.
and that sort of society has an equal obligation, and potentially as a result of that, equal authority over the child. Um, you sort of see this in conversations with schools and what parents can and can't know and things like this, about
Yeah.
the way that
Uh,
their child is being brought up.
Another important note is it feels as though there's an attack on ownership as well, which may be even more
Fundamental.
foundational.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in this argument. Um, and that's the. I mean, when we look at today, what ownership looks like, especially if we look at something like um, property ownership or ownership of things that we've made or applied our work to, like, um, I mean, let's say money or goods. I feel as though it's hard to really own anything anymore. And that's a sort of, people have fought and died for a lot less than that. But we've gotten to the point, it seems like, because we have to blame ourselves too, that as a society, as a society, we have agreed to allow certain individuals to dictate what the rest of us get to have and the limitations of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and obviously, you assume that people's best interests are being kept by those individuals in power that we have placed there. It's our fault. Again, it's each individual's fault. Um, but we do see restrictions on what feel like basic human human rights, like even just ownership
Right.
or what we're allowed to do. So I don't know if you want to take that somewhere or if you want me to.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, so let me fill in some of the gaps real quick. I don't think we
Yeah.
need to spend a ton of time here, but so now we're getting to the point. Our little uh, micro world that we've been constructing here is getting bigger pretty quickly, and I think that's reasonable, because eventually either there's other men and you find out you weren't the only one, or your family gets so big that eventually the world's populated and there's other men, and they're all going to have their own families and their own selves to whom they have obligation, and there's limited resources in whatever area you populate, and so there's going to be some contest for those resources rather. So there's a couple different perspectives. The main ones are John Locke, who we've talked about already, and Thomas Hobbes. Kind of briefly outline those ones. I don't know how much time we want to spend in this stage, but basically John Locke's kind of perspective is all about ownership. He thinks that in order to own things, people are going to kind of contest each other, and in order to maintain peace, because nobody wants to die, we have to continue. We already kind of talked about that obligation to the preservation of our current mode of existence being something that's there for everybody. So, in order to preserve that, knowing that things can escalate to violence when you're getting it, when you're competing for resources, people would pretty quickly just kind of decide to take what they need and not much more than that, and let the other people take what they need and continue to live in harmony. Thomas Hobbes has a bit more cynical view. He thinks that most of the time people are gonna um, just go to war, basically, over resources and kill each other. And so, in either case, a society becomes necessary. For Thomas Hobbes, society and governance becomes necessary because people are killing each other, and there needs to be something to stop that. In Locke's case, people just aren't that good at managing resources, and they're going to try, and they're going to kind of try to do it peacefully, but it's not going to go that well, because either some people are greedy or some people are just ignorant or unintelligent and can't deal with managing the resources properly. And so either way, you end up needing a authority to settle disputes and to appropriately manage the resources, or to appropriately um, impose laws and authority against people to stop war.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
not to make it more complicated, but what was it that Rousseau? Because he had a slightly different take as well on the then coming about needing a society, right?
Yeah, we didn't spend a ton of time with Rousseau in our class, and I think that's probably okay. I've read some of his stuff since then. Rousseau basically thinks that society is actually a great lie, like a great deception, and that it's actually the state of nature is actually so blissful and utopian, and people left to their own devices would be good at maintaining peace and would be good at managing their resources, unlike John Locke and Thomas Hobbes think, and that it would actually societies are basically the power hungriness of other men coming to impose their own authority upon us, um, basically kind of corrupting what's already there, promising more security or more um, properly managed resources, but actually it's just going to end up corrupting us and leading us all to become worse people. And that comes from his perspective that man is basically good, and that the only reason he's not good is because society corrupts him. I don't think that really makes any sense. So I don't know how much time we want to spend on that. I mean, we can. Maybe I'm sure there's some people that maybe think that. I think anybody who's spent any amount of time with a child knows that man is not inherently good.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, so I used to work at a daycare. That was my first job. My church had an outreach, and so there's young children. Actually, I'll also bring in Augustine's Confessions. Even infants who are born are not this sort of like completely innocent, completely good tabula rasa that are corrupted by society. I think we're born relatively selfish. We're born making demands of other people and giving nothing back. And these are things that people would consider immoral now as adults. And I think there's little reason to say that that's moral. That to change the morality of that, depending on how old you are. Obviously, we as adults have obligations to children that are special, but that doesn't mean that selfishness or a lack of care for other people or an what's the word, rebellion against authority, or any of these things. These are all things that are kind of inherent to children, and
Well,
there's many good things about them. I'm not trying to say that they don't do anything good. I'm just saying that I think children. A lot of people think of children as very innocent. I don't think that's the case. And I think if you read Augustine's Confessions, he does a very good job of outlining all the things that he did as a child that would be considered immoral if he did them now as an adult. And he thinks that morality is objective and doesn't change depending on how old he is. And so basically, yeah.
Yeah. Just to give the counter argument to that, a lot of people would say that, well, I think it's important to ask is self-preservation and trying to stay alive, is that selfish?
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes what we see in infants, and I'm not talking about children, I'm not talking about those who know better, but infants, they sort of don't have an understanding of much other than basic survival needs. They don't know how to articulate that. So is it selfish to cry when you are starving, when you need food? Because if the claim is that is selfish, then that would be something many people would disagree with, I think. What would you say?
Well, I mean, I would say, and I think you get this idea if you read Confessions more, beautifully than I'm going to articulate it. But I think what an infant does is not simply crying when they actually need something. There's I think most people that let me caveat this by saying I've never had an infant. I've been around plenty. I've been one, although I don't remember it. But I I think if you were to make the claim that an infant only cries whenever there's something necessary that it's lacking, or I don't want to use the term "it." That's kind of something that's crept its way into our language that I find objectionable. So I apologize if I slip up. But I think somebody making the case that an infant only cries when there's something that they actually need would have difficulty doing that. And it's not just that they maybe don't understand that they have enough food, or they're just not used to being hungry. They also cry for various other reasons. Sometimes they just want attention, or sometimes they want there's yeah, like if the parents are not giving the child suitable attention, or something like this, then all of a sudden that demand manifests itself in the form of crying, or making a scene. And so
Yeah,
I think the capacity of an infant for selfishness goes beyond the mere need for survival, and goes into things that humans continue to crave and continue to cry, so to say. Obviously, the mode of our complaining changes as we get older, but basically, we make a lot of the same demands, and I would say selfish demands of our parents and other people around us as infants, that we will continue to make later on, in our selfishness, I guess is how I'd respond to that. Yeah.
yeah. But as we continue to make them and grow, we do see the effect that they have. That, I mean, we learn what is required to get to certain things we think we need, or it definitely seems as though infants should, and rightly so, take on a lot less blame.
Mm.
So I would say that I personally might fall alongside or along with the grouping of people who attribute at least a little more blamelessness to infants and children, than I guess you would. Um,
Yeah, I guess my response to that would be, I think that there is a higher amount of grace that ought to be afforded people in ignorance, whether that's because they're an infant, or that's because they simply didn't learn something. We kind of know that that's how justice and mercy works, but I don't think that changes the underlying morality of the action. The claim that I'm making here is not that infants are equally culpable for the um, their tantrums, than adults are. But what I am saying is that from the very beginning, man is characterized by moral failure, and whether that's because of ignorance, or whether that's because of willful ignorance, or if that's because of intentional denial, I think regardless, it's the case that moral standard is there, and that man falls short of it from the very beginning.
really, so even if we were, since we're here, we take it back to man in the state of nature. Is what I mean. Go that far back, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you think that man is guilty?
I mean, I guess it would depend on what he's done and what he hasn't. But I mean, it also depends on kind of how he comes about. Does he come about as I'm trying to articulate what I'm trying to say. Like, so if we're looking at like Adam, I'm trying to think of a more concrete example. Like, do I think he started guilty? No, but I think that since sin has entered the world, I think all the descendants of Adam are equally cursed with it. So maybe perhaps an infant would have been less selfish pre-fall of man. But I think what we're working with now is that man comes into the world with sin, or with moral failure, to use a less religious term. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
That's something I'll definitely have to think more about. Yeah, it just doesn't quite sit right. But I guess it would also be a good time to wrap back to sort of why we started talking about that,
Yeah.
because different views on whether or not man is going to handle his resources, his relationships, and the state of nature properly. Some people would say that, take one side that they would be more peaceful, or at least that men would take what they need or should take what they need and not much more. And then some would say that man does want to take more than he should, and then we would have conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, and to wrap up the thing with Rousseau, I think whether we think that, whether you agree that an infant is capable of moral failure or not, I don't think it takes very long, even without society, for a man to fail morally. Even if it was just the man existing with nature, I think he would very quickly fall prey to greed, for example, taking more than he needed, and maybe realize the consequences of that, and maybe learn that that's not good. But I don't think that man has this sort of like inherent goodness that Rousseau thinks that he does, that is corrupted by society. I think the capacity for evil is within each man, and happens pretty quickly.
Interesting.
Okay, well, so maybe you agree with Rousseau. Maybe we need to spend more time on this because I wasn't aware of that. So would you? Well, let me just open up the floor. I guess I've been talking a lot. So do you think that um, do you think that if that things would be better if we were in the state of nature without society? I guess let me put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I think another problem we run into is we kind of look at the society we're in, but that's not necessarily what society would be if it were to come just from the state of nature.
Mm-hmm.
We have different examples throughout history of people groups who were better at managing the resources, and at the very least, even if they fought with each other, they didn't take much more than they needed because they had a better relationship with understanding how that would affect the rest of them. Um, Even if we take a rather short trip back in time to just like the Native American groups, um, specifically in North America, they moved with nature in a lot more ways. Not that they were perfect, but that we often associate those people groups with not taking much more than they needed from the land because they were more grateful for it or something like that. It at least seems that that's possible. Um,
I would also say that those groups were characterized by like near constant war. If you look back at history with one another, um,
yes.
and I think that might be characteristic of some greed in a way. Maybe not taking more from the land than they need, but perhaps um, not being willing to share it with other groups, or but
Yeah.
maybe finding a more bountiful piece of land and not being, and wanting to take that for yourself rather than leave it to the person who's already collecting from it. For example, like obviously they didn't
Yeah.
have like the land ownership concept that we do now, but it still worked roughly the same way, and there was still plenty of attempts to seize land that others were using.
Yes. And I think if we look at something like that, another pattern that you could recognize is that the bigger groups, like the Cherokee, these were the warring nations, the bigger groups, right? Smaller groups were more migrant. They died off a lot quicker. They were captured by the bigger groups.
Mm.
But it seems like that ambition of bigger groups to keep growing is what causes the imbalance, the shift, the violence, and the greed. Whereas if a group was okay with staying round about the size it was, it could live more in harmony with other people groups as well as nature. Maybe not perfect, but it seems possible. So,
Right. But I don't think it's really possible that a people group stays roughly the same size. I mean, the ebb and flow of population is something that's difficult to track, and I don't have a ton of statistics to back up my claims here. But my thought is people are going to continue to have children, and they're going to continue to grow, and also as they become more prosperous, more capable of living within their environment, people are going to live longer. And so you have a natural increase in size of individual families, let's say, even before we move into like tribes or nations or anything like this. And I don't think it takes long before, um, I think if you're moral, I don't think it takes long before a need comes about to provide for more people. And I think pretty much anybody, society or no, is susceptible to the potential moral failure of wanting to take that from somebody else. And I don't think that that's caused by the increase in the size of people. Um, but I think if you're moral, if how moral you are is only based on on your capacity to commit evil, then I don't think it's really morality. Like I think the maybe we're viewing things in a different causal chain. So like to me, bigger groups are more likely to take things from other people, not because they wouldn't have before, but just that they couldn't before because they're smaller. You know, you kind of are in a position where you don't have any other choice. But eventually, once you have the power to take things, I don't think the fact that you're getting bigger causes you to want to do that. I just think you don't, that option previously isn't available to you, and so you don't.
Interesting. Yeah, because the way I was looking at it was like, let's say that the group like naturally starts to grow, like you're saying. I mean, I think it would be natural to want to have more kids if you could. So the group begins to grow. Then along with that comes the needs of the group begin to grow. But that doesn't seem particularly morally wrong for the needs to grow along with the size.
Yeah, I agree.
If and then what you're kind of looking at there is, would that be the only reason to want to consume more from the world? Because let's say that there's not another people group, but the lone group that was small begins to grow and decides to stay unified. It at least seems like at that point you could still be relatively ungreedy.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they were to split and not be warring with each other, like not taking things from each other, they could still go about it in a way that isn't greedy and isn't theft and isn't war. Um, and it seems like you would want to. I mean, I imagine I would want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you could. The question I guess that I'm asking more is if you will, or if any individual group, any group of people will. Um, I think it only takes one person with less control over their sinful tendencies to start corrupting the rest of the group. And I think even I don't think that what am I trying to say here? If I look introspectively, there are many things in which I've sufficiently conditioned myself to only want what I would say are moral goods. But I think there's a lot of things still in which the desire for a moral evil occurs to me. And so it's certainly possible for me to override that and say, no, like that's not good. I'm not going to do that. And maybe from a consequentialist standpoint, I say, well, that's going to lead to this consequence, and I don't want that, so I'm not going to do it. Or maybe even better than that, I say, oh, well, that's morally wrong, and so I'm not going to do it for that reason. But regardless, I think what I'm trying to say here is that I think it's possible for any group in in the state of nature to override their unethical desire for more power or more food or more resources in general or whatever it is. But I don't think it's very clear that they always will. And that's sort of Rousseau's claim, is that they have that inherent goodness, and the only thing that makes them bad is society.
Yeah, which, I mean, if we're just going to look at it, that make sense? I mean, if you and I, hypothetically, were to go off into a land that's all alone and we have our set resources, we would start working together. We would create our own families, our own lineages, and we would try to live alongside each other. And you and I are relatively intelligent, and I wouldn't say we're that much more than the average man, And I feel like you and I would try to set something in place between our families that would be long lasting after us, that was, you know, a healthy relationship with each other's families.
Mhm.
And hopefully pass down a method of learning that helps to educate all of our offspring on the importance of why we work together, and take care of the land.
Mhm.
And I imagine you and I would also do the best we could to make sure that we could do everything within our power to preserve it for as long as we could. And after us, I imagine we both want that. Um, so unless some outside force came in
Mhm.
and tried to convince us that there was a better way to do things than what we would both want in that scenario,
Mhm.
then doesn't it seem like we wouldn't do something else? And that seems like the claim that Rousseau would make, is that they just wouldn't, unless that outside force, that force in his example would be society, would sort of impose on them a set of standards that would cause them to behave in a different way. Because I wouldn't want to take things from you, but I'd want to work with you, right? And I imagine you would feel the same towards me. And we would also try to make each other better.
Right. Yeah, and I don't doubt that we would do that. But we also have, I think, mastered or thought a lot more about what's good and what's bad from a consequential and moral standpoint than the average bear. And I think that, and I don't think that if there were another man that came in with just his family and wanted to take things from us, and we had to go to war with him, like, he's just as much of a man in the state of nature as we are, and I don't think it would require society for him to come to the conclusion that he wanted to take things from us.
But that would be, at this point right now, having grown up in the society we've grown up in. And we've had to go against it in many ways just to
Mhm.
learn.
Mhm.
Um, so that wouldn't convince me that in the state of nature that he would want to behave that way.
Yeah,
Just that,
I guess the only way that I could convince you of that would be to look introspectively. I think for me, it seems pretty clear to me that I always have a good and moral part of me that wants to do good and moral things, and an evil and sinful part of me that wants to do evil and sinful things. And we've talked about this before, it's sort of the distinction between the flesh and the spirit that Scripture talks about. But I think that that part is always there and is inherent to me and needs to be mastered. And I think people master it to various degrees. And I don't think that society causes that evil and sinful part to be there. I think it would be there regardless. I don't know how else to articulate that besides just when I look inwards toward myself, it seems that way.
yes, but I think what I'm trying to say, I'm not trying to disagree with that. Yes, we would have tendencies we would want to work on, but I wouldn't, even for a second, if I thought of doing something that was more selfish or more greedy or more evil, I wouldn't want to damage the nature around me, ruin the resources for my offspring, or hurt you and your potential offspring. I just that I wouldn't want to do that. Even if I had these things in the back of my head, I had to learn to master, like you're saying.
Mhm.
That wouldn't cause me to be more greedy. And I wouldn't want to steal from the only other guy I'd be doing this with, hypothetically in the scenario, or from your family if we got really big. Or even if we brought more people, I wouldn't. Theft and greed and, you know, violence wouldn't, they just wouldn't be the solutions I would go to.
Right, and I think that's true of you, and I think that's true of me as well. But I do think there are people that are different, and I think other people have mastered their evil side less than we have. And I would be skeptical of the claim that it's only society which has caused them to be that way.
Yes, but I think what we see in society, or at least, yeah, I think what we see in society that we don't like is we often see things that are set up to teach us how to be better at being destructive. I mean, better at consuming more, better at taking more than we need. I mean, even something like as simple as, uh, money, modern money. Um, it teaches that the sort of just the idea of the paper dollar and gold teaches us to hoard and to take more than we need, and we're taught to be afraid that we won't have enough. So we keep taking, we keep bringing it in case someday something happens where we won't have enough. We'll have what we've stored so that we can enjoy the. I don't know. It seems rather perverted
Yeah.
to teach children to want money, which is something that we're taught in our society and something that we're very proud of being able to make a lot of money and keep it when I don't know that that's even that. Yeah, that seems like something that if it was you and I going out into nature building something, we wouldn't think, how can we make a currency? Maybe we would in 20 years, but I don't even know that we would go through with that. But if we bring that idea with us, along comes all of the issues that come with money and come with greed. But we can choose not to bring those into the society.
We don't even need money. You can be greedy in a bartering system. I don't think money itself is. I don't think currency is the problem, and I think this is maybe where our disagreement is. I definitely agree with you all the way that our society, trains us to be more greedy and more power hungry. But
more a lot of things too. Maybe more violent, maybe more
lazy, more pretty much every sin you could name. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I don't think that that's because there's this monster out there called society which causes man to be that way. I think man is that way, and therefore society is that way. I don't think it's society is that way, because I can't even conceive of society apart from the nature of man. And that therefore causes man to be that way. Like, I don't know where. Well, it's difficult to define what society is. Like, how could society be a corrupting force if you can't have society without man? And if you can't have society without man, then society takes after. If man creates society, then society takes after the nature of man. And I think man is sinful and corrupt, and ergo society is sinful and corrupt. I don't think it happens the other way around.
Correct. How the one thing I guess maybe that we're looking at here is that, or that I might be looking at, that's kind of causing this sort of disconnect, is that, like, I guess being out of touch with society. So like the society, right, that man is a part of has gotten so big, so connected, so distant from what the individual is, that it's like some sort of mega society where, like, if I were to leave society as like American society, South Carolina, Hollywood, if I were to leave this society and go on and be a society of one, it's much more manageable. There's a lot less evil I'm going to participate in because
or encounter, for sure,
yeah. And then let's say you're introduced to this society and you bring your inherent evil and I bring mine, and we both are wanting to get rid of the inherent evil. You and I are going to work together to do that, right? And the society of two, it almost feels like we would be able to be more productive in the society of two, and raise our families more productively, and then maybe one other family would join us, and in that smaller society we would be able to navigate sort of the evil that we bring in inherently. We don't have to act on. We would be able to help each other navigate that better than we can in a society of millions and millions and hundreds and thousands of all of these people with all of these regulations on whether or not we're actually allowed to help them be better.
Okay, and so this I agree with. I think we've come to the point. I think the claim that Rousseau is making is that man is inherently good, and you could have any number of men existing in nature together without a governor, so anarchy more or less, and have exactly what you're talking about. My understanding of what you're saying is that every time you add another man, you add more of a chance of moral failure. Each man is theoretically a percentage of chance of moral failure The more men you add, the more possibility of moral failure you have, and eventually you have enough people who are evil that they'll take advantage of people and rise to the top and gain power, and you have this kind of society. Is that a appropriate understanding of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that might be closer.
Because
Yeah, which I get.
that I would certainly agree with.
Yeah, and I don't. I guess I should have been clear. I don't know that I necessarily agree with Rousseau. I just had some qualms with the other guys.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I think I would probably agree with most of those. But I think, yeah, I my qualm with Rousseau is that I don't think man is inherently good, and I don't think society is what causes him to be bad. I think man is evil, but with an overriding capacity for good. And I think depending on who you start with, you can have a great little thing going for a while, but I think, like you, I believe that the more people you add, the more chance of evil you have. And so this is where I need to, I guess, get down to the brass tacks of what Rousseau would define society as, which I don't know that I can say accurately. Um, I think for Locke and Hobbes, it's something like the social contract. For Rousseau, I guess the question would be: is just existing together in the same space, is that what society is? Um, I don't know. I don't know if that's sufficient to say that that's society. In my mind, that's more the state of nature. But I think even in the state of nature, existing together with no obligation to one another, but simply trying to kind of keep going without war, I think eventually the more people you add, again, the more chances you have for moral failure. Even within your own family, the more children you have and whatever, people, you're eventually going to run across somebody that fails to control their evil tendencies. And I think you have a much better chance of stopping those things from happening in a smaller group of people, which is small government, which I'm sure we're going to get to as we continue this sort of political philosophy exploration. But I would disagree with Rousseau that man is inherently good and that no amount of men in the state of nature would bring about evil.
Cool. What's our time right now?
We're at an hour 17.
Should that be the end of part one?
Yeah, maybe so. If you would agree with that, or if not, maybe we can just agree to disagree. But I want to make sure that we wrap up this kind of discussion we've been having.
Yeah, no, yeah, that seems closer to right. I still think I attribute a lot less even potential for sin or evil or bad moral behavior to infants and children,
Mm-hmm.
I think, than you would, even though I have a great appreciation for the confessions. Yeah. That being said, I do agree that it seems like the more people you begin to introduce, you have the more possibility for a greater growth of possibility for evil.
Cool.
So I think we're on the same page about that.
All right, yeah, and maybe we can tackle the whole infant moral culpability thing later. I don't think that's super necessary to our political philosophy discussion.
Yeah.
And maybe we can both do some more research on that, because I don't know how many, I don't know if I could articulate my thoughts any better than I already did, and I don't think I did it as best I could. So if we want to revisit that at a later time, we certainly can. But for now, I think this is a good spot to end this part of our political philosophy discussion. Basically, we're at the point where we think that the state of nature, even in the state of nature, the more men you bring about, you're eventually going to run into corruption. And so there's something that we want to do about that. And Locke and Hobbes, rather, are going to say that is society, that society mitigates the evils that could come about in an anarchical state of nature, which maybe we'll agree with and maybe we'll disagree with, but that'll be part 2. All right. Sounds good.